the food resiliency piece and get a walkthrough from Beth St. James of a bill that is on our wall, H-165, that came to us last week. This is an act relating to school food programs and universal school meals. The concept should be familiar to everyone because we've already looked at the legislation that the House passed last year and that we all remember was only for 1 year. And we've heard testimony from various other folks on the impact of the program this year. So now we have a bill that that proposes to extend the program beyond this year. So this is a starting point, and we'll get a walkthrough of the bill. And I just mentioned to Beth that today, anyway, if folks have questions as we're going along, raise your hand and we'll stop in the moment because this is specific language and probably makes the most sense to try and get as much clarity as possible on the language that's here while we're there, in the paragraph. So let's go ahead and get started. Are there any questions just about what we're doing here before we get started? Okay, well, let's go ahead then.
Great, thank you. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I am not used to sharing my screen, so and I can't see behind me, so if something goes wrong, please let me know. So you should have H-165 in front of you. This bill proposes to require all public schools and independent schools for their publicly tuitioned children or students to make breakfast and lunch available at no charge. It is essentially the exact same. There are some small changes that I will point out, but it is almost exactly the same as what was in the Universal Meals Bill last year. Just plunked out of session law because it was a 1-year program and put into Title 16 into the school foods chapter. So the language is almost identical with some small changes. Do you want me to go over the findings? They are exactly the same from last year.
Yeah, no, I think it would be good to go through the findings and just to familiarize. We don't need to debate whether the right findings or whether they're sufficient, but I think just so that we all are clear on what we're saying, that would be a good place to start. And just to back up for a second, the implications of what you were saying earlier about the bill, last year's bill becoming part of session law and this year's being part of the title, this would be a permanent. What this bill proposes is a permanent change rather than a 1 year or a temporary.
Yes, as you all know, session law carries the same weight and effect as anything in your green books, but the language last year contained a repeal for July 1, 2023. This is plunking it into Title 16 in the school foods programs chapter with no repeal date in there. So it would be there in perpetuity until the legislature changed it at some point in the future. So the first finding, we're on page 2, starting on line 1, subdivision 1, that according to AOE, an average of 38% of students across all supervisory unions during the 2019-2020 school year qualified for free or reduced price lunch. And that led to some school children facing more challenges than others in succeeding in school and in life. And the General Assembly recognizes that students need fresh and nutritional foods to enable them to focus on their education, and that many students come to school hungry. Providing universal school meals offered at no cost to students or their families creates a necessary foundation for learning readiness during the school day.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, Representative Levitt.
I'm already getting questions from my constituents where we're getting these numbers. And so is there a data, is there a link, something that we could point them to?
Yes, somewhere in my file from last year, there is backup for all of these findings.
Okay.
I don't have them with me today.
Okay.
But yes, certainly.
Great.
Yes, Representative O'Brien.
What happens if this passes a statute and then the state doesn't come up with the money?
Then that would be considered an unfunded mandate potentially. So this is requiring public schools to offer this. It's not an option. And so if that money was not provided for by the state, it would fall to the school districts to make up that money. The way this is drafted now.
But the way that it's drafted does include a requirement that the state provide the money.
Yes, the last section, other than the effective section, is an appropriation. I'm going to keep going. Great. Subdivision 2 on line 10. A 2021 study by the National Food Access and COVID Research Team found that in the first year of the pandemic, nearly 1/3 of people in Vermont faced hunger, and families with children were 5 times more likely to face hunger. Food insecurity rates remained above pre-pandemic levels a year after the start of the pandemic. Subdivision 3, in a 2019 research report, the Urban Institute found that up to 42% of children living in food insecure homes may not be eligible for free or reduced price school meals. Subdivision 4, on line 18, in 2016, the Center for Rural Studies at the University of Vermont partnered with the Vermont Farm to School Network to measure the economic contribution and impacts of farm to school programs in Vermont. The final report found that school meal programs support a vibrant agricultural economy, we're on page 3, with every $1 spent on local foods in schools contributing to $1.60 to the Vermont economy. Subdivision 5, a study analyzing trends in food sources and diet quality published in 2021 found that the most nutritious meals consumed by children in the United States are school meals, including when compared to meals cooked at home.
Wow.
And the last finding on line 7, subdivision 6, a study conducted by UVM found that universal school meals programs in Vermont were associated with, among other benefits, improved overall school social climate as a result of financial difference being less visible and improved readiness to learn among students overall.
Questions so far? I had wondered when that study was conducted, just in
I will make a note of that.
Yes, Representative Wilson.
I would like it to be clear, is the state mandating that people have to do this?
It's mandating that public schools do this, yes. Provide free lunch and breakfast through the school food programs. So there's a difference between like the a la carte, like pizza, chicken nugget, Dorito options, and the meals that are subsidized by the federal government through the school food programs. And those are the free meals we're talking about here. But yes, this does require public schools to do that.
Do they have any idea that this is unaffordable? I don't understand how you can do it.
Are you asking if it's affordable?
I'm asking, does the state realize it's unaffordable?
That would be a great question for someone from the administration.
Joint fiscal's coming this week. They will let us know.
Good.
So we'll have, we'll have testimony from various state agencies, from our own joint fiscal office. We have, just as a point of reference, we have been doing it for the past year, and then for the 2 years-ish of the pandemic, the federal government was supporting it. And also, I don't think this was your question, but just to be clear, there's no requirement that parents or students participate in the meals that are offered. They can certainly bring their own meals. And, yeah, Representative Lipsky.
It's no secret, I've really been riveted by this subject, and primarily, and you outline a lot of the positive impacts and value from universal school meals. This year that we're about 2/3 of the way through, those funds that provided these universal free school meals came from a state budget that was allocated, not a federal budget.
Correct. They came out of the ed funds, yes.
The ed fund. So I went to our schools and got universal support for the values of this, continuing this initiative. And I'm a believer in it. But my question is, and this comes up in every discussion, where you are on the spectrum of all in or not. What if there are affluent families, and I come from a considered to be a more above average affluent community, not family. But if in that community there are affluent families and they say, well, you know, we should be paying our share, we can't afford to pay our share. Why is that not an option? And the shaming piece of, you know, stratifying who's going through the lunch line or the breakfast line. Why in 2023 do we not have technology that doesn't differentiate who's passing through the line? So that's leaning to Charles's point. Somewhere it's going to cost the state money.
So I'm going to answer for Beth and just remind the committee that she is, so good question. And we will have that conversation, but not today.
Okay.
So today we're just going to walk through the bill as it currently is written. And we'll save, and I think we've got some time actually scheduled tomorrow morning, first thing.
We do.
Laura, is that correct? Are we? Yeah.
Yes.
So when we come in tomorrow morning, we will have a chance, just the committee, to have a discussion about what we've heard today, what concerns people have about the bill, about the general topic. So make a note of that one.
Yeah.
Yep.
I already have.
Thank you. Okay.
I don't have any answers on it.
I saw some other hands. Should we keep going or questions about so far?
So we're just going through the bill. No,
Just-
and any questions we have, make a note. We'll talk about it
I had a
tomorrow,
question about
specifically about
like, what does that mean, or
Right.
clarification on what's in the bill. So the bill drafter won't necessarily know why language was used. I mean, as we all know, if to the extent that we've worked to have our own bills introduced, it is it's a process, but some questions are better saved for the presenter of the bill, who we'll also be hearing from. But really it's sort of, and what are the legal implications of doing such and such? That would be a good question. Don't hesitate to raise your hand if you have a question. If it seems like it's not the best time, we'll let you know.
Thank you. And I have no problem saying it's not me. Ask away. So we are in section 2. We're on page 3 there, right on line 12. Now we're in the green books. Now we're in Title 16. So section 2 proposes to amend chapter 27, subchapter 2, which is the school food programs subchapter in Title 16. So the first section that is seeing an amendment is on line 14 there. It's section 1261A, and it's just the definition section. And you all are familiar, you've had walkthroughs before, you are familiar with strikeouts and underlines and what's new, what's current, great. You'll see there's just a little clarification there on line 20 on page 3. School board means the governing body of a school district. That's added because we're going to add some stuff about independent schools in there. So we're just clarifying there. Page 4, there is a conforming change there on lines 2 and 3 that just convention, instead of saying United States income taxes, we say U.S. income taxes in our drafting conventions. And then the big substantive change is on line 4 with the addition of a subdivision 4 of approved independent school. For the purposes of this subchapter means an independent school physically located in Vermont and approved by the State Board of Education under section 166 of this title. Section 166 is the approved independent school process. So that's the process that independent schools go through in order to become an approved independent school.
Representative O'Brien.
Is meals defined in rules or at the University of Education?
Meals, no, but food programs is. And the meals, for breakfast and lunch, those, I believe the federal programs specify what's in a breakfast and what's in a lunch. And then we refer to the federal programs.
Approved independent school, so, there's another category. Approved means something, and the other category,
Is recognized.
recognized. Can you just explain the difference and whether, if it matters?
Sure, this, so approved and recognized schools, the process to become an approved independent school or a recognized independent school all falls under section 166 of this title. That process is done, by the State Board of Education. And, couple things here. One, in Vermont has a compulsory, or mandatory attendance age in the state for education. So if you are a child between the ages of 6 and 16, you gotta be in school. And not just any school qualifies for that compulsory attendance. So attendance at public schools, attendance in approved independent school, or attendance at a recognized independent school with some other specialty programs on the sides there. But it's really only approved independent schools that are approved to accept public funds. Recognized independent schools are not getting students tuitioned to them. And so that's really the important differentiation here. The next section, we're on line 4. We're still in section 2 of the bill. But because we are all under that one subchapter, we're just going to go statute by statute. So line 7, we're going to make amendments to section 1262A, which is the award of grants section. So this section's in, you can see there's a whole bunch, it starts with a whole bunch of language that's not underlined or struck through, so that's current law. This is the part of Vermont law that spells out how funds are getting to schools for the free and reduced price lunches already, that are already, federal funds are flowing through AOE, and the state picks up currently a portion of the reduced price meals. So this is an amendment to the statute that talks about how that money is getting to the schools themselves. So on line 17 there, on subdivision 2A, we're adding the language about public schools. So this is language that's taken directly from the Universal Meals Bill last year and plunked right into this section. So for public schools, from state funds appropriated to the Agency of Education for this subdivision 2, the agency shall reimburse each school district that made available both school breakfast and lunch to students at no charge under, and there's a reference to a subdivision that we'll get to next, from the cost of each meal actually provided in the district during the previous quarter that qualifies as a paid breakfast or paid lunch under the federal school breakfast and federal school lunch programs. So the current law is talking about how those funds are flowing for the free and reduced price meals. And this new language is saying that the state will appropriate funds to AOE to also cover, so there's the free lunch, the free meals, there's the reduced price meals, and then there's the paid meals. And this is saying the state is now going to cover the cost of each paid meal that is actually provided. It goes on, we're on page 5. It goes on to say, though, on line 2, that reimbursement from state funds shall be available only to districts that maximize access to federal funds for the cost of the school breakfast and lunch program by participating in the community eligibility provision or provision 2 of these programs, or any other federal provision that, in the opinion of the agency, draws down the most possible federal funding for meals served in that program. For the federal school food programs, there's different ways you can participate, and I would highly recommend asking the agency to speak to the ins and outs of each of those. But for purposes of this section, it's saying you got to draw down the most federal funds that you can. And then new language that was not in last year's bill is starts on line 7 to 8 on page 5. Second, breakfasts do not qualify for reimbursement under this subdivision.
Are they hobbits?
Again, I would really encourage you to hear from the agency on why this language may be necessary, but this is new from last year.
Can I just ask, your second breakfast something that happens?
It happens at my house.
I mean, at a house, sure, maybe not doing chores, but I've never heard of it at a school anyway, so sorry, okay.
Representative O'Brien.
Second lunch isn't mentioned.
Oh, good point.
I don't have any information that second lunch is a concern, but I would highly recommend you hear from the agency on this language and the concept of second breakfast and perhaps the challenges they ran into employing the program from last session without this language.
So the important point perhaps is that this is new language
Yeah.
that wasn't in last year.
Correct.
And the agency suggested that perhaps, maybe the agency suggested that it would be useful to.
I think it found its way into this draft through testimony that was taken, and there was some concern about this. I believe it was also in the report from the agency that you all, I think Rosie did a nice walkthrough for you at the beginning of the session.
Representative Lipsky.
You're talking about second breakfast in the school. If you ate breakfast at 6 a.m, then got to school at 7:45, you're not talking about them getting a
Yeah.
egg sandwich at 7:45.
That is an excellent point, and my understanding is that this language is meant to say 2 breakfasts at school. But that is an excellent point for consideration for clarity. Can we move on to subdivision B? Okay, we're on page 5, subdivision B. So we just talked about public schools. Now we're talking about approved independent schools. And it's almost exactly the same language with some new language that I will point out, but the concept is the same in that the state will now cover the costs of the paid meals actually provided at an approved independent school if it participates in those federal meals programs. Not every approved independent school participates in the federal meals program, nor are they required to. And it would only be the costs for the students attending on public tuition. Couple new things here. On line 18, this language is new under Roman numeral 1. If the approved independent school participates in the food programs as a site under a public school food authority, there are supposed to be 2 schools there. The approved independent school shall be reimbursed only for students attending the approved independent school on public tuition. Again, this came out of a concern raised by the agency in how approved independent school students on public tuition were accounted for. And that had to do with the way these school food programs are administered. And I would, again, highly recommend hearing from the Agency of Education on A, how these school food programs are administered, and B, if this language meets what they are looking for.
Representative Rice.
Just to clarify, that is already how independent schools participating as their own school for the 30 were being reimbursed, right? This is just language that clarifies that if they're participating under a public school.
Yes, and the next subdivision on the top of page 6 gets to that. So there's kind of umbrellas for schools' food programs, and there might be more than one school participating under that umbrella. And my understanding is that some approved independent schools are participating on their own and some are participating under the public school umbrella. And so this differentiates between how those students are counted. So on page 6 there, if the approved independent school is its own school food authority and it participates in the community eligibility provision or is in a year other than the base year of provision 2. Remember, there are multiple ways to participate in the school foods programs. These are just 2 of the ways. The school shall provide the agency with the number of students attending the school on public tuition and the total number of students enrolled in the school. There's some calculations that the agency has to do depending on where in a cycle of accounting and depending on which program the school is participating in and how they are factoring those meals. It has to do with how the meals are actually counted in various different cycles. So because an independent school is not going to have just publicly tuitioned kiddos there, right? There's going to be some amount of private payers. And this bill only provides reimbursement for the publicly tuitioned students. The agency has to calculate the percentage of students attending the school on public tuition, multiply that number by the paid student percentage, and the results of which shall be the number of meals the school shall be reimbursed for. Again, I highly recommend hearing from the agency on like a real world example of how this would play out, as well as if this language meets the concerns expressed in administering the program last year. Page 6, line 9, there's second breakfasts again. I will just leave that there. And again, on line 11, approved independent schools are only eligible for reimbursement under the section if they're actually operating one of these school food programs. And they also, on line 17 there, have to maximize their access to federal funds. Lines 11 through 16, 17 through 20, and then bleeding onto page 7 are right from last year's language. It's the same.
So I think this probably goes without saying, but an approved school does not currently, and it's not anticipated they would be required to offer meals.
Correct. This bill does not require them to, nor does current state law.
Representative O'Brien?
I may have missed this, but does this include pre-K, say PCC type situations on campus at these schools?
That's a great question, and I think that there's ambiguity in that. And I would encourage you to take testimony on whether this language, first of all, what the agency did in administering the program last year and whether there needs to be further clarity here. It's just specific to public schools and approved independent schools. If those schools also had pre-K programs, you would need to hear, I think, from the field on whether they were counted. And then that would be the legislature's purview on whether or not your intent is to include those students. But I think that's a great question.
Representative Cole?
So, well, maybe we should get through the rest of the bill first, but one thing that isn't in here in language wise has to do with local foods. And just how the local foods incentive grant is the backbone, I think, to making this program work in the way it should, so that we aren't just purchasing from caterers who are cheap and have bad food. Of course, it's still food access, but it's not necessarily nutrition. And so with this the reimbursement style of the local foods incentive grant, which is 15 cents per meal for if you have 15% more, that money would go to the supervisory union. But in this case with this bill, if it is to pass, it's not necessarily the supervisory union, but rather the state who is going to be paying for the meals. And so the local foods incentive grant, you'd think that would be returned to the state because that's where the payment is coming from. And so the incentive for participating in that program in particular, it seems like there's not as much of an incentive to participate unless perhaps we make it more explicit in here, because the state is the one who really wants that incentive, basically the reimbursement for this, because that's who's going to be covering this, in addition to the federal program, of course. I know maybe that was not an appropriate time for that question, but.
No, it was brilliantly said.
Did you have a?
I was just gonna say, I am not familiar enough to speak to the local food incentive program because it's not a part of this bill.
Yeah, exactly.
It didn't really come up last session.
Yeah.
I know it came out of S100 into different legislation in the 2021 session. So I'm not familiar enough to speak with how they interplay today. I can certainly look at that and would encourage you to hear testimony.
Yeah, maybe thinking about incorporating new language if the, incentive structure works out in a way that makes sense.
So, yeah, I think let's put that one in the parking lot for tomorrow, but also later tomorrow we have tomorrow's Farm to School Day, and we're going to be taking some testimony from somebody, I think, on the local food incentive. So we'll have a chance to dig into exactly how it works and the mechanics of it as well. But yeah, but we can also add that to the things we go over in the morning too. Just about, general about the bill. Okay.
And I will look into that and familiarize myself with it, and be able to speak to that the next time if you decide to have me in. There may be, I don't know, but there might be some federal requirements on the school food programs that are different than the local foods incentive grant. I don't know. Remember, this is not the only food that the school is providing.
So can you say that again?
It's possible that these meals are not the only food that the school is providing. These are just the meals through the federal program, but I will certainly look at that piece. So we are on page 7, line 3. Reimbursement amounts for public schools and approved independent schools are going to be calculated the same. So the reimbursement amount, and again, this is language straight from last year. The reimbursement amount for breakfast shall be a sum equal to the federal reimbursement rate for a free school breakfast, less the federal reimbursement rate for a paid school breakfast, using rates identified annually by AOE from payment levels established annually by the USDA. The reimbursement amount for lunch is the same as for breakfast. So it's the federal reimbursement rate for free, less the federal reimbursement rate for a paid school lunch. There's a small amount that's coming, and that's what the state is kicking in.
So the takeaway for me in this section was, and I think I knew this, but this made it a little more explicit, that the school districts receive a reimbursement even for the students who are not eligible for free or reduced lunch. So the paid category, there's also some amount, I think you just said a small amount, and we don't need to get into how much that is, but there is something that comes from the federal government for every student who.
Yes.
But in an earlier section, it said for meals that were actually eaten or actually given out. So it's not just everybody, it's actual meals that they gave to students.
Yes.
The actual number of meals, not just we have 1,000 kids. We're going to say we had 1,000 meals, but maybe they only had 500 kids actually eat those. So those only those 500 get counted.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
But yes, I think that's absolutely the case, that students who don't eat at all are not part of this conversation.
Okay.
Who don't eat one of these meals, what are we calling these meals?
The meals, I think the federal program will call them for a paid the paid lunch or the paid breakfast.
Okay, so that there's some small amount of money, and we'll learn more about that when we talk to other people, I think, about how much that actually is.
So we are on the next section here is 1264 in Title 16. And that is the food program. So again, this is current law. So each school board operating a public school shall cause to operate within each school in the school district a food program that makes available a school lunch and a school breakfast according to those federal programs, and to each attending student who qualifies for those meals under these acts every school day. On page 8. On line 1, in addition, each school board operating a public school shall cause to operate within each school in the school district the same school breakfast and school lunch program made available to students who qualify for those meals under the federal programs for each attending student every school day at no charge. An approved independent school may cause to operate the same school lunch and the same school breakfast program made available to students under the federal programs. To each student attending on public tuition every school day at no charge. So this first section was the nitty gritty of how the money is calculated and getting there. And then this section, it's a little backwards. This section is kind of establishing the program, if you will. And then on line 11, this is Again, language taken directly from last year's Universal Meals Bill. In operating its school breakfast and lunch program, a school district in an approved independent school shall seek to achieve the highest level of student participation, which may include any or all of the following: providing breakfast meals that can be picked up by students, making breakfast available to students in classrooms after the start of the school day, and for school districts, collaborating with the school's Wellness Community Advisory Council, established under subsection 136E of this title, and planning school meals. That cross references just to the Wellness Community Advisory Council. And then on page 9 there.
I'm sorry, the language in section C there, that's existing language, or that's language it was in last year's?
Correct, yes. It would be new language to Title 16, but it was the same language from last year. And then on page 9, subdivision D, a school district and an approved independent school shall count time spent by students consuming school meals during class as instructional time.
Oh, curious.
And then this is a repeal. So section 1265, remember, we talked about school districts. There's language that we have talked about and then we read through that requires a school district to participate in the federal meals programs. This exemption exists in current law in the Green Books, basically saying that if a school board wishes to be exempt from the school food programs, they can vote to do so. And then they have to revisit that decision annually. And they have to notify AOE that that's happening. In the school meals bill from last year, there was a moratorium on this. It was temporarily paused. And this bill proposes to repeal that requirement altogether. So there is no exemption for a public school to participate in the school foods programs. They have to participate.
And so just to be clear again, up until this current school year, this exemption existed in statute. And I think maybe we heard something from the agency, but we can revisit it. What that actually meant, how many districts were taking advantage of this exclusion. And then during the pandemic, how did it play out?
Oh, I don't know that question. I don't know the answer to that question. That'd be a great question for Rosie.
Thank you. Good.
And Rosie, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I keep throwing all of these questions my way.
Yeah.
Section 3, we are on page 10, line 10. This is an amendment to the education fund. This bill proposes that the money to fund this mandate is coming out of the education fund. How familiar are you all with the education fund?
2.1 billion.
Okay, so not the numbers. So the education fund, section 425 in Title 16, specifies very specifically what money in the education fund can be used for. And then there's a separate subsection that's not included in this bill because it's not necessary, but it's referred to as the nuclear option. And it basically says, if you use money out of the ed fund for anything that's not specifically enumerated here, we repeal the property tax automatically. So you will see over education bills, there's lots of notwithstanding that section so that you can do a one-time program or a one-time appropriation, if you will. But this bill proposes to make this a permanent program. So it's adding language to the education fund use to allow that money to be a normal use of the education fund. So line 16, subdivision 6 is to make payments. The monies in the education fund shall be used for the following, 1 through 5, and then to make payments required under subdivision 1262A C2 of this title for school food programs. And then page 11, the last page of this bill, section 4 is an appropriation. The sum of 29 million is appropriated from the education fund to the Agency of Education for fiscal year 2024 to provide reimbursement for school meals under the award of grants section that we went through. That was the first section we went through. And then the effective date is July 1, 2023.
Representative Levitt?
I just have a question about, because the 29 million Rosie indicated was probably high. And we haven't, I guess we can just adjust that once we get the numbers, because we haven't got the numbers for November yet. So we don't know, because she said that was the month we'd have a real sense of how much we were actually spending on school meals. So have we gotten that report yet? Does anybody know?
I don't think so. I think that information, I don't know off the top of my head. I think that information's coming from JFO.
Oh, okay.
And you all have possession of this bill, so you can change that number.
Right.
But that's the number in the as introduced version.
Got it.
Representative Cole?
Yeah, a huge portion of this program relies on federal dollars. And this sum here is our state, filling the gap of what federal, I don't know if that's the appropriate terminology, filling the gap necessarily, but like, I imagine federal, we do not have control over, and that will fluctuate from year to year, of course. And so if, for example, we don't need to spend this 29 million, that will be left in the ed fund, basically. Yeah.
Yes, if this appropriation went away or this bill did not pass, that 29 million would remain in the ed fund.
So this is like a safeguard that if we, if federal funding for whatever reason fluctuates in this year, not that it could change that quickly, but we would be safe because we have this designated in the ed fund.
This appropriation is specifically for the money the state would be paying to cover the difference between the federal amount for a free meal and what the federal amount for a paid meal is. It does not account for anything, any of the federal funds that would be used for the it doesn't account for any of it's not trying to cover any of the federal monies. It's the state's portion of paying for covering the costs of a paid meal for all students in Vermont. So it doesn't supplant any federal money.
Yep. Thank you.
Representative Lipsky?
But to Esme's question, beginning July 1, 2023, there are no federal funds for this program, or am I? There are.
Well, that's what sort of CEP is.
Yeah.
Yes, so the federal breakfast and the federal lunch program have been running for a long, long time. I think maybe what you're thinking of is the pandemic.
Okay, yeah. I guess that's
And that expired I believe it was last June.
Representative Rice?
Yeah, I was just gonna clarify. that.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but I wondered whether, given the bottom of page 10, the language that section 3 has, is it necessary, I guess the answer must be yes, or it wouldn't be here, to spell out the appropriation in section 4?
When you say necessary, what do you mean?
Well, so I guess this goes back to Representative Cole's question too, sort of, but if we didn't have the language in section 4, would the language that's proposed for section 3 essentially cover it so that whatever the cost was would be, I'm looking at the bottom of page 10, section 3, it says it's make payments required under subdivision 1262.
I see what you're getting at. So I have kind of two answers. One is the language in section 3, so the education fund amendment is kind of the permission, the okay to use that money out of the education fund. Otherwise, you could put in, so for example, last year, the appropriation in the universal meals bill, in the appropriations section, it said, notwithstanding 16 VSA 425D, which is the nuclear, we repeal the property tax option. So that money could come out of the education fund. Now, because this is a proposed permanent program, we're building that in so we don't have to notwithstand it every time. So that's kind of the permission to use money out of the education fund. If you, I highly recommend taking a look at the Universal School Meals task force report that came out last January, I believe, and they talked about different ways these appropriations could be structured. So there was the general fund option, and then there were kind of two ways to take it out of the ed fund. There was an off the top option, and there was a requirement to have school districts build it into their budgets. So then it would automatically come out of the education fund. This is the off the top option. If you didn't make that off the top option, but you did amend the education fund to allow this to be a permissible use of the education fund, school districts would essentially have to fold that into their budgets. And you're right, it would come out of the ed fund. So this would be a policy choice on how that is provided for. And I am not the right person to speak to the consequences of those choices. I would really encourage you to hear from JFO on that.
Okay.
Does that make sense? A little bit?
It does make sense, and we'll definitely, I think, want to follow up with JFO on that. I think the comment here is that as written, it doesn't talk about anything beyond fiscal year 2024, so there would need to be something else happening next year.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
If that's correct, then Representative Rice.
I just, a clarifying question around your use of you're saying that this is sort of the permission in section 3. But it does use that shall language, which I've come to understand as being a sort of, that's more than permission, that's direction, right? So it's saying, this is the things the money you will use the money for. And so it's not, in that way, it's not, if my understanding of that shall, the use of shall is correct, it's not permission, it's direction.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I offer a little small piece of clarity? So the money, I believe the money that covers the free meals or the state's portion of the reduced price meals is coming out of the general fund. And I believe that that's, you're seeing that in the budget every year. And that's part of the, I would assume what the agency is putting into their budget. If this were to become a permanent program, it would probably move, towards that kind of every year in the budget, there's an appropriation for universal meals. But this is a new concept. And so I would suggest that is a policy decision on where this money is accounted for. If you don't account for it somewhere, whether that is in this bill or through coordination with your colleagues and other committees, and this language were to pass without an appropriation, then it would become that kind of unfunded mandate that's just going to get wrapped into school districts' budgets, like that.
Good. Other questions? Are there, and if you don't have the answer to this, we'll ask somebody else. But are you aware of other appropriations that are sort of parallel that come off the top of the ed fund, the way that this proposed?
I do not know off the top of my head.
Question.
All right. Well, here it is, 4:00. And we're going to adjourn at 4:00, so we'll look at that.
Well done, Mr. Chair.
And well done, committee, for questions and for holding the questions. I think we all have about, what else could we do, but I think we have a pretty good sense of what's here right now. And that if you don't worry that, we won't have more time to go through this. If we decide that we want to make changes, add language, we'll have you back in, and I'm sure there'll be questions that come up again. Just can you go over that part again, and what are we doing here?
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for the.
Welcome. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your hard work.
So tomorrow, we don't have any witness scheduled for 9:15. We have the farm to school folks are coming in starting at 10. So I thought it would be a good time to talk about the questions that we decided we would hold until tomorrow. It's only 45 minutes. So again, I don't want anybody to feel like that's the extent of the time that we'll have to talk about the pros and cons, because not everyone necessarily feels that this is, I realize, the bill as written is the way to go. And I think then during the day too, it'll be a good chance to sort of listen to what folks that are coming in have to say and think about, are there other things that we could be doing here? Farm related, for example. But I think having a really good handle on what is this bill doing is a good place to start. So thank you for your good questions today. And anybody have any final thing to throw out?
We meet tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
9:15.
9:15.
Yeah.
Which gives us 45.
Yeah, because there's only 45 minutes. Yeah.
A rabbit hole.
Yes.
45 minutes of rabbit hole.
But it'd be good to organize the rabbit holes and then figure out who we need to bring in to help us understand what each bucket means.
And then at 1 o'clock, JFO will come in to walk us through the report that you mentioned that
Fascinating.
they just put out. It's not all that long, so if folks have a chance to look through that, it's more about the funding piece, but it just gives just another sort of reinforcement for this. Yeah. So the legislature last year asked JFO to report on how would we fund this if it were to be made permanent, or at least going forward to some extent. And then, Laura, can you remind me who's coming in at 2 tomorrow? Somebody who just added, right?
Yes.
Well,
It's Jill Remick.
Jill Remick.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So that's a different conversation, but.